The Galactic Council laughed when Earth left, their laughter rolling through the great silver halls of their floating capital, like the sound of metal striking metal, sharp and cold. They laughed because they thought humanity's silence was weakness. They thought this was the end of a tired species, a broken power that had lost the will to stand. The ambassadors from the strongest empires leaned back in their chairs with smug smiles, their eyes reflecting the empty seat where the Terran representative had once sat. That seat had always been a reminder, a symbol of the quiet force humanity carried, and now it was gone. They celebrated like children who believed the shadows had vanished because they closed their eyes. They didn't see it. They didn't hear it. But something in the air had changed the moment Earth walked away. It didn't happen with grand speeches or flashing weapons. There were no threats, no fire, no roar, only the quiet closing of doors. One by one, Terran embassies that had stood for decades dimmed their lights and locked their gates. Their staff disappeared in silence. Their flags were taken down in the dead of night. Terran ships that once moved through the trade lanes like silent guardians slowly vanished from every known sector. Not in a rush, not in fear, but with a calmness that unnerved those who were paying attention. Convoys stopped arriving. Outposts went dark, and the famous Terran signal that had been a part of galactic communications for over a century simply disappeared. At first, no one believed it. They thought it was a game, some political trick, a way for Earth to get leverage in the Council. For years, humanity had been the quiet stabilizer of the galactic order. They rarely shouted, they rarely threatened. But whenever chaos grew, whenever empires fought, humanity would step in, not with words, but with action, calm and calculated. They didn't need to declare war to end it. They had done it before. Everyone remembered the First Border War, when two great empires were on the brink of burning half the galaxy, and a single Terran fleet arrived, silent and unannounced, and in 48 hours, the war ended. Not because of violence alone, but because everyone knew what it meant when Earth decided to move. Humanity was feared, not because it was loud, but because it didn't have to be. And then, without a single announcement, without a single council session or negotiation, Earth walked away. They shut their borders and sealed their skies. They stopped answering calls. No ships left Sol. No transmissions escaped its orbit. Terran colonies in distant systems quietly went dark. Ships withdrew. Industries stopped producing for anyone but themselves. To the galaxy, it looked like a retreat, a silent surrender. But to those who knew the stories, who had seen Terran fleets up close, it felt like something far worse, because Earth had never been the type to retreat. When it was silent, it was calculating. The Galactic Council chamber was bright that day, its golden pillars shining as the suns outside passed over the glass ceiling. Delegates from dozens of species gathered in their flowing robes, elegant armor or strange translucent skin. At the center, the council speaker rose and spoke with an almost gleeful tone. Let the record show, humanity has abandoned its seat on this council. There was applause, real applause, the kind that comes from those who think they have won. One alien with silver tendrils for hair whispered to another. Good riddance, their shadow was too heavy anyway. Another, a scaled warrior with dark green eyes, laughed. Without them, we can finally breathe again. But in the corners of the room, there were a few faces that didn't smile. Old diplomats, veterans, those who had seen the black ships of Earth glide through the void without sound. They remembered the night skies above their worlds turning dark when Terran fleets arrived. They remembered how silence never meant surrender. One of them whispered to another, "You're all fools," but no one listened. They were too busy celebrating. In the weeks that followed, the galaxy changed in ways that no one at the council truly understood. At first, everything seemed normal. The great empires kept trading. Pirates still raided the border routes, and small wars burned in distant corners. Without Terran fleets watching, many believed it was their chance to grow. They started pushing into systems once protected under quiet Terran influence. Some even sent warships close to the Sol border, laughing as their transmissions mocked Earth. "They've finally gone quiet," one broadcast said. "They've accepted their place as a forgotten species." But when their fleets approached the border, they found nothing. No defenses, no ships, no resistance. Only silence, but it wasn't the silence of fear. It was the silence of a door closing. No one knew what was behind that door. No one dared cross it. Trade routes that once relied on Terran patrols began to falter. Pirates grew bolder. The Council sent fleets to stabilize things, but they quickly learned what humanity had always known. Patrols without weight meant nothing. The pirates struck faster, more viciously, because they no longer feared the black ships of Earth appearing without a sound. Before, one human cruiser showing up at the edge of a star system was enough to make raiders scatter like dust. Now there was no such presence. Convoys began to fall. Merchants whispered about the good old days when the Terrans were watching. In a distant sector, a border skirmish between two empires escalated into full war in a matter of weeks. In the past, a single Terran envoy or a single ship in orbit would have frozen both sides. This time there was nothing. No Terran transmission, no envoy, no threat. The Council sent out pleas to Sol, but the messages were never returned. They bounced against an invisible wall of silence. Humanity had turned its back, and for the first time in a century, the galaxy began to feel what a world without Earth truly meant. Back on Earth, the skies were clear. The great cities were quiet. Massive shipyards that had once supplied galactic defense were now building for no one but themselves. Orbital platforms went dark to outside eyes. Deep space scanners were turned inward. The Terran fleet did not shrink. It simply vanished from sight. In the void, entire armadas disappeared beyond mapped space. Humanity wasn't dying. It was withdrawing, preparing, watching, and the galaxy mistook it for weakness. On the Council floor, weeks after the departure, the empty Terran seat remained untouched. The Speaker had ordered it removed, but no one dared touch it. It was strange. It was just a chair, a carved block of black steel with no decoration. But every time someone walked past it, they felt something in their chest, something heavy, like the weight of unspoken warnings. Delegates avoided looking at it. Some even began to whisper, "They'll be back." But others, louder, laughed it off. They're finished. The galaxy doesn't need them anymore, but the galaxy did need them. They just didn't know it yet. Far out beyond the edges of the mapped stars, Terran ships gathered in silent formations, their engines dark, their signals cold. The fleet that the galaxy thought had vanished had not gone far. It had simply gone quiet. In those ships, no one spoke of returning to the Council. They didn't talk about diplomacy. They talked about watching, about remembering, about making sure the galaxy learned what it truly cost to take Earth's silence lightly. In that silence, the storm had already begun. The first empires to feel the weight of it weren't enemies. They were allies. When pirates and raiders pushed into their territories, they called for Terran support like they always had. No response came. They sent more messages. Still nothing. Then the raids grew worse. Systems burned. Trade collapsed. And those empires, once proud and loud, whispered to themselves, "We should have never let them leave." The galaxy didn't understand it yet, but Earth had not surrendered anything. It had only taken its power back. And in a galaxy built on the quiet foundation humanity had created, that absence was a wound that would only grow deeper with every passing day. The Council still mocked. The ambitious still celebrated. But in the shadows, some had already started to feel it. A diplomat from a small system, standing before the empty Terran seat, whispered under his breath, "The stars are colder without you." And far away, in the black void beyond the mapped edge, Earth listened. It didn't speak. It didn't roar. It didn't warn. It simply turned its back and waited for the galaxy to understand the price of forgetting who had kept it safe for so long. The Council chamber was no longer filled with laughter. It was filled with whispers, small, sharp, uncertain whispers that echoed through the silver arches like cracks in glass. The seat where the Terran representative had once sat remained empty, untouched, like a wound the galaxy didn't want to admit existed. And that empty chair became heavier with every meeting, because even those who had once celebrated Earth's departure could feel it now. Something had changed, something they couldn't control anymore. Trade reports came in slower. Convoys were vanishing along old routes where Terran patrols once moved like silent guardians. Small border disputes between empires began to rise, like weeds in a field left alone, and still, the Council did nothing, because they didn't want to admit they had built their world around Earth without ever saying it out loud. They told themselves it was fine, that the galaxy didn't need humanity, that the great empires could manage without them, but every day another piece of the old order fell. Small incidents at first. An unmanned colony station raided in a sector that had always been safe. A small empire cutting off cooperation agreements because Terran enforcement wasn't there to keep them honest. And then larger problems came. Trade unions dissolving. Border systems arming themselves. Once quiet systems turning loud and violent. Because everyone knew that the one thing holding it all together was gone. And no one wanted to admit it. The Council tried to act strong, sending out its own fleets, writing declarations, demanding compliance. But their ships didn't carry the weight Terran ships once did. Their threats didn't make pirates flinch, didn't make empires hesitate. The Terran fleet had never needed to speak to be obeyed. Its silence alone had been enough. But now there was only the Council's noise, loud and empty, like children trying to sound like giants. The delegates who had once mocked Earth began to avoid looking at that empty seat. A few of the oldest ones began to ask the question out loud in quiet corners. How long can this hold? But the younger leaders, the loud ones, they waved it off. Earth was just a piece, they said. We will manage. They didn't understand that Earth had been the center of everything, not by force but by gravity. A quiet pull that held every star in place. Some empires tried to approach Earth again, not publicly but through quiet back channels. They sent small envoys, traders, whispers, hoping for a reply. None came. The transmissions fell into the void and disappeared, as if the Terrans had vanished entirely from the stars. And that silence, colder than any declaration of war, echoed through the galaxy like a storm approaching on soft feet. In the Council, the debates turned bitter. Allies turned suspicious. Enemies became bold. Everyone spoke more loudly than before. But no one was really listening, because without the weight of Earth, without the quiet balance it had provided, every empire started to look out for itself. The cracks had started small, but now they were spreading like fractures through glass. And above them all, the stars where Earth watched stayed silent. No threats, no movements, no answers, and that silence was louder than any fleet. The cracks that had started as whispers now spread like fractures through the stars. No longer hidden beneath council speeches and fake smiles. They were everywhere, growing, sharp, and dangerous. The galaxy had built itself around Earth's quiet gravity without even realizing it. And now that gravity was gone, everything was starting to fall apart. Trade routes that had once been calm and safe had turned into hunting grounds for pirates and raiders. Entire fleets that once relied on Terran presence were too weak to hold their borders. And the Council, once full of proud voices, was beginning to sound like a room full of desperate children pretending to be kings. Empires that had spent decades calling themselves allies now pointed fingers at one another. Their diplomats shouting across the chamber while the empty Terran chair sat in the middle, silent, heavy, untouchable. A reminder that something powerful had walked away and wasn't coming back. The first major collapse happened at the edge of the outer trade spine. A corridor of space that had thrived for a century under Terran security. It was never written down, never signed into any law, but everyone knew that Terran ships passed through there, always watching, never announcing themselves, and that was enough to keep every pirate crew from even trying. But now the black ships were gone, and on the third cycle after Earth's departure, a swarm of raiders descended on a convoy carrying supplies to 3 colonies. The convoy sent calls for help. The Council dispatched a fleet, but it arrived too late. The colonies burned. The convoys were stripped clean, and the raiders vanished into the void. No one even tried to stop them, because without Earth, there was no one left to fear. In the Council chamber, the arguments grew louder, filled with blame. Some said the Jacques Empire was behind the raids. Others said it was the Syndicate worlds testing the new power vacuum. But none of their words mattered, because deep down, every delegate in that shining hall knew the truth. The galaxy had always feared Terran's silence more than it feared any army, and now there was no one to fear. That was why the pirates were bold, why empires were pushing their borders, why everything was breaking. Humanity had never needed to rule to keep control. They just existed, and that was enough. In a border system near the Red Nebula, two neighboring empires clashed for control of a mining world, something that would have never happened when Earth still watched the stars. Terran envoys didn't need fleets to end conflicts back then. A single black diplomatic vessel entering orbit was enough to make both sides step back. But now no envoy came, no voice spoke, no shadow fell across their skies. And so they fought. Their fleets clashed in orbit. Their cities burned, and their governments collapsed into endless fighting. Thousands died over a world that had once been silent under Terran eyes. Inside the council itself, the loudest voices grew louder, desperate to fill the void that humanity had left. They promised fleets, promised peace, promised order, but their ships were scattered. Their words empty, their unity fragile, and with each passing month, their promises sounded less like commands and more like pleas. Some smaller nations, frightened of what was coming, began to pull away entirely, fortifying their borders and refusing to send representatives to the council. They didn't trust anyone anymore, not without Terran shadows to keep the balance. The most powerful empires started to do what they had always dreamed of doing, testing their strength. Old rivalries that had been frozen by Earth's quiet presence began to move like sleeping giants, stretching after too long. Border fleets massed, new alliances formed in the dark, and war drums that had been silent for 100 years started to echo again. There was no one to stop it this time. No Terran fleet would arrive unannounced. No cold, silent warning would freeze their ambitions. In a remote star system, an old admiral stood on the deck of his ship, watching the trade lanes flicker with distress signals, his hands clenched at his back. "They're coming apart," he whispered to himself. Not as an enemy, not as an ally, just as someone who had seen what Earth had been. A quiet force that held the galaxy together with nothing but its silence. And now that silence was turned inward, leaving the galaxy to tear itself apart. On Earth, the skies remained calm. The fleet still existed. Hidden, patient, watching, humanity did not speak, did not answer the hundreds of transmissions flooding their borders. They did not open their gates, and that silence was beginning to feel like a blade pressed to the galaxy's throat, not because humanity was attacking, but because the galaxy was destroying itself without them needing to lift a single finger. The galaxy had thought Earth's silence was surrender, but it was something far worse. It was absence, and absence has a cost. The council just hadn't realized how high it was yet. The whispers had turned into shouts. The cracks had turned into open wounds, and the galaxy was bleeding without realizing how deep the cut went. In the beginning, everyone had laughed at the empty Terran seat. Now no one even looked at it. The chamber that had once echoed with loud arguments was now filled with voices that trembled. Old rivals were gathering fleets at their borders. Old grudges were being remembered, and small wars had already turned into fires that spread faster than the council could contain. They had always assumed Earth's silence had no weight, but now they felt it like a noose tightening around the stars, not because humanity was attacking, but because they had left the galaxy to itself, and the galaxy didn't know how to survive without them. In the southern trade arm, the first major war began. Two medium empires who had been forced to stay in check under Terran shadow finally moved their fleets, each convinced the other would fold like paper, without Terran patrols to appear from nowhere. Without Terran cruisers watching from the void, they attacked freely, their fleets clashing in orbit over a disputed industrial world. The war burned for weeks. Systems burned with it, and as more worlds fell, others joined, hungry for power, certain that humanity's absence meant there would be no consequences. The skies that had once been calm under Terran silence now glowed with the light of hundreds of battles. Entire sectors became lawless. The council scrambled to respond. They issued demands, sent peace envoys, tried to sound strong, but their words meant nothing, because everyone remembered how different it had been when the humans spoke. Humanity had never needed to shout. A single broadcast from Earth had been enough to freeze entire fleets in place. A single Terran warship entering orbit had been enough to make aggressors sign peace within hours. They had been the storm no one wanted to wake. But now the storm was gone, and every empire thought itself powerful. In a dark war room far from the council, one admiral slammed his fist into the table, his voice rough with fear. "This wouldn't have happened if they were still here," he growled. His advisors stayed silent because they all knew it was true. The Terran fleets had never asked for tribute, never demanded control, but they had kept the galaxy balanced in their own quiet way, not through words but through the threat of what they could do if pushed. The galaxy had mocked that silence for decades. Now it was learning how much it had depended on it. A mining sector on the outer rim collapsed into chaos when raiders turned into warlords. Small powers began carving systems for themselves. The Council begged its member states to send fleets, but no one trusted anyone anymore. Why risk their ships to save others when they barely trusted their allies? Fear was growing like rot, and in the middle of it all was a single empty chair, a single quiet world at the heart of human space that refused to answer their desperate calls. For the first time in generations, the great empires who had once sneered at humanity started to feel something they hadn't felt in centuries. Fear, not of war, not of enemies, but of the silence itself. It was like the galaxy had been holding its breath, and now it was suffocating. They had grown so used to Terran fleets appearing in the dark whenever things got too close to disaster that they didn't know how to function without them. The war in the southern trade arm spread like infection. Small battles merged into larger conflicts. Alliances crumbled in weeks. Treaties broke in days. All it took was one leader saying, "Earth is gone. No one is watching us now." And that was enough to make a dozen others do the same. Greed was louder than reason, ambition louder than memory, and slowly the entire galactic network began to collapse under its own weight. Back on Earth, humanity watched. From hidden outposts and black fleets stationed beyond the edge of mapped space, Terran ships monitored every battle, every transmission, every desperate plea for help. But they did not respond. They did not send a single ship. The humans who had once kept this galaxy in balance now watched in perfect, merciless silence. They had given the galaxy peace, but it had laughed. Now it would learn what that peace had cost. One council member, old and tired, stood before the empty Terran seat during a stormy meeting and whispered to no one in particular. We thought their silence was weakness. His hands trembled as he looked around the chamber. But their silence was strength. And we broke it, no one answered him, because they all knew he was right. And somewhere out in the void, beyond the reach of any empire, a massive Terran fleet drifted in the darkness like a sleeping beast with its eyes half open, waiting, listening, patient. Humanity had not disappeared. It had chosen to let the galaxy see what it really was without them. And the galaxy was not ready for that truth. The galaxy was burning now, not with the sharp precision of war between giants, but with the messy, uncontrollable chaos of predators fighting over a carcass. It had started with small border conflicts, then spread to trade disputes, and now entire sectors were tearing themselves apart. Fleets that had once hidden in the shadows were now launching open invasions. Old enemies who had once dared not cross certain lines were now crossing all of them at once. They all believed the same thing, that without Earth, no one was watching anymore. No one was coming to stop them. The storm that had always lived in humanity's silence was gone, and they thought that meant they were free. The council chambers were in shambles. Voices shouted over each other like wild animals. No longer controlled speeches, but desperate cries. Each empire blaming the other, accusing their neighbors, threatening to pull out of old agreements. And in the center, the Terran chair remained untouched, as if carved out of the shadows themselves. Its presence alone made the air heavy, and no one wanted to be the one who sat there, because everyone remembered who used to sit in that chair, and how quiet the room would get when they spoke. Now there was nothing but noise. Pirate fleets became empires overnight, their warlords carving pieces of the galaxy like scavengers ripping flesh. Once powerful alliances that had lasted generations crumbled in weeks. No empire trusted another. No voice carried weight, because the one voice that had always spoken last, Earth's, was gone. Some tried to imitate humanity's cold authority, declaring themselves the new center of order, but their fleets were not black. Their silence was not terrifying, their power was not real, and the galaxy ignored them like wind against steel. In the outer rim, an entire star cluster fell to a coalition of raiders and mercenaries. The Council sent fleets to reclaim it, but half of them never showed. The other half turned on each other before even reaching the target. The battle reports that reached the Council were nothing but screams and static. And still, the messages kept coming every hour, every minute. Send help. They've taken another world. The border is gone, but there was no help to send. Not anymore. Earth's fleets had always been the last line, the quiet hand that could end a war in hours. Now there was only silence. Envoys began to beg. Proud empires that had once laughed at Terran restraint now sent transmissions towards Sol. Encrypted, formal, then desperate, begging for help. Begging for Earth to return. We were wrong, one message said, a voice shaking as the station behind it burned. We need you. Please answer. But there was no answer. The messages hit the void like stones thrown into deep water, disappearing without a single ripple. Earth didn't reply. Earth didn't even acknowledge they were there. Whispers turned into fear. Fear turned into stories. Stories turned into myths. Pilots who strayed too close to Terran borders claimed they saw shadows in the dark. Massive ships that didn't move, didn't speak, didn't show on scanners. Watching silently, some said the humans were waiting. Others said they were never coming back. That the galaxy had finally lost the only force that held it together. And in council chambers and war rooms, even the loudest empires began to understand the bitter truth. They hadn't defeated Earth. They had driven away the only thing that had kept them from destroying each other. In the southern trade arm, a fleet of desperate empires tried to rebuild what they had lost. They met in secret, signing new agreements, swearing they would bring order themselves. But before their signatures were dry, two of them turned on each other, old wounds bursting open, their fleets clashing over who would lead, and the so-called alliance burned before it even began. This was what humanity had held back. This was what Earth's silence had kept buried. Not peace, but chaos. Inside the council chamber, one of the oldest delegates rose slowly to his feet, his face pale, his voice cracking. We thought Earth was just another empire, he said softly. But they were the wall that held us up, and without that wall... His voice trailed off as the sound of another distant fleet burning filled the chamber's comm screens. We are nothing but rubble. No one argued with him. No one had the strength left to pretend anymore. And far away, in the cold dark past the galactic rim, the Terran fleet waited, engines quiet, hulls black, listening to the chaos they had once prevented, watching the empires that had mocked their silence now choke on it. They did not move, they did not speak because they didn't have to. Earth had walked away, and the galaxy was learning the cost the hard way. Humanity's absence was louder than any war, and the stars were finally starting to understand what they had lost. The galaxy had always believed it was strong, that its power was built on the great empires, its fleets, its councils, its treaties, its technology. But now that strength had rotted away like an old wall stripped of the beam that held it up, it was never the empires, never the treaties that kept everything standing. It was Earth, and only now, in the fire and silence, did they understand what they had lost. The stars burned with hundreds of wars. Entire sectors were swallowed by conflict, and the Council, once proud and loud, had become nothing but a flickering light in the dark, trying to command a galaxy that no longer listened. The great trade rings that once connected thousands of worlds were shattered. Raiders controlled the major corridors. Black market warlords rose from the ashes like scavengers feasting on bone. Entire planets fell without a single Terran ship lifting a finger, because humanity had walked away, and the void it left behind was something no one could fill. The Council sent pleas into the dark, messages wrapped in desperation, begging Earth to return, promising alliances, promising forgiveness, promising anything. But there was no voice on the other side. No light, no fleet, no warning, just the endless, heavy silence of a world that had chosen to turn its back. In the northern border sectors, the first of the great empires fell. Their fleets burned not by enemies from outside, but from their own civil war. Their people were tired, angry, afraid because they had grown used to stability that had never been theirs. It had belonged to the humans, to the silent Terran ships that once kept predators away, to the quiet but unshakable presence that no one dared challenge. And when that presence vanished, everything else cracked like glass. The Council watched the fall of that empire with cold faces, but in their hearts they knew they were watching their own future. In another sector, a fleet of refugees moved like a river of broken light through the stars, millions fleeing burned worlds, their transmissions filled with begging, with the same single name whispered again and again. Earth, Earth, where are you? Their words traveling into empty space. Bouncing off the black wall of silence like rain on stone, they called for help. But no help came, because Earth wasn't listening anymore. Earth wasn't theirs to command. And that was the price of their arrogance. Inside the once great council chamber, the leaders argued like frightened animals, no longer powerful, just loud. Every empire demanding Earth's return while still refusing to admit their mistake. They abandoned us, shouted one, pounding his clawed hands on the table. But the old diplomat from the Andari sector rose slowly and answered in a quiet, broken voice. No, we abandoned them first. The room fell silent at those words, because they all knew the truth they had tried so hard to ignore. Earth had never needed them, but they had always needed Earth. Whispers turned to fear. Fear turned to regret. Regret turned to desperation. Fleets began to send probes toward Terran space, hoping to find anything, even a whisper. But those who went too far into the black never returned. Their signals vanished without a trace, and new rumors spread across the galaxy. Whispers about shadows moving in the dark, about ships the size of cities that did not speak, did not broadcast, did not miss. Humanity wasn't gone, it was simply watching. And that made the galaxy tremble more than war ever could. In one of the few remaining loyal worlds, an old counselor stood before a crowd of frightened leaders, his hands shaking as he spoke. We thought their silence was our freedom, but it was the rope that kept us standing. And when we cut it, we fell. No one clapped, no one argued, because outside their walls another world was burning. Another fleet was dying. Another piece of their fragile galaxy was disappearing into the dark. Back on Earth, deep beneath the quiet oceans, Terran fleets remained hidden, vast and patient, their engines silent, their weapons cold but ready. Humanity hadn't forgotten the galaxy. It had chosen to let it see its own reflection without the Terran shadow covering it. And that reflection was ugly, weak, and fragile. The humans didn't need to fight to make their point. The galaxy was doing the job for them. Every empire that had once mocked Earth now whispered its name like a prayer, like a curse, like the last hope that might save them from the fire they had lit themselves. But Earth did not answer. It didn't need to. The lesson had already begun, and the galaxy had only just started to understand the cost of losing the quiet force that had once held the stars together. Humanity's silence wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the weight of power no one could escape. The council chamber was no longer a house of power. It was a hollow cage echoing with fear. The walls that once shimmered with confidence now felt smaller, colder, like the galaxy itself was holding its breath. The leaders who had once laughed at Earth's silence now stood broken. Their fleets shattered, their alliances gone, their voices shaking like children who had realized too late what monster they had mocked. The wars they had unleashed had spread like fire through dry grass, and there was no one left to put them out, because the only power that had ever kept the galaxy balanced had already walked away. Across the stars, great empires that had stood for centuries were nothing more than smoldering ruins, their fleets scattered, their colonies burning, their people fleeing through the dark. Refugee convoys drifted like rivers of broken light, whispering a single name into the void, Earth, over and over, not in arrogance now, but in desperation, like a prayer spoken by those who know it will never be answered. The galaxy had mocked humanity's silence, but now that silence was everywhere, pressing against their throats like a hand. They had asked for a galaxy without Terran power, and now they had it, empty, broken, burning. A ruined fleet commander sat in the shattered bridge of his flagship, listening to the last transmissions of his people, static and begging, asking for help that would never come. His eyes fixed on the black beyond the stars, on the invisible line where Terran space began. He whispered into the dark, "We should never have let you leave," and his words disappeared into nothing. Inside the council, the surviving delegates gathered in a half-destroyed chamber, their banners torn, their guards gone, the once golden floor smeared with soot and dust. No one shouted anymore. No one blamed anyone anymore. The arrogance had been burned out of them by their own greed and fear. And as they stood there in silence, their eyes turned one by one toward the empty Terran seat. The same seat they had laughed at, the same seat they had ignored. Now it felt like a wound they couldn't close. Some whispered that if they begged, Earth might return. Others feared that humanity was no longer listening. Some said they had seen Terran ships in the dark, massive, black, silent, watching but never speaking. Shadows that moved between the stars like predators waiting to see if the prey would finally understand its mistake. No one knew if the stories were true, but everyone was afraid of the silence. In a distant star system, a broken alliance sent a final envoy toward Terran space, one small ship carrying a single plea. No demands, no arrogance, just a simple message recorded on an old channel. We were wrong. Please, men, return. The ship crossed the border into the black void and vanished. No one ever heard from it again. The galaxy realized then that humanity didn't need to wage war to win. It didn't need to shout, threaten, or attack. It simply had to turn its back, and the galaxy tore itself apart trying to fill the void it left behind. Earth had been the quiet weight that held everything together, and without that weight the stars fell into chaos. And far away, hidden in the black where no signal could reach, the Terran fleet drifted in perfect formation, their engines silent, their weapons cold but ready. They watched without mercy, because this had never been Earth's defeat. It had been the galaxy's choice, and choices had consequences. Humanity had not vanished. Humanity was waiting. The Council's final transmission went out across what was left of the galaxy. Not a demand, not a declaration, just a single line spoken in a cracked voice. We finally understand. But there was no answer, and that silence was the last lesson. Humanity's power was never in its words. It was in what happened when it stopped speaking. And now the galaxy would live in that silence, remembering forever the cost of mocking the world that had once kept the stars from tearing themselves apart.